did Nancy Pelosi win in her spat with President Trump over the State of the Union? Were the Covington Catholic boys being racist towards a Native American activist? Should Trump have recognised the interim president of Venezuela? And find out what the media missed in our most underreported stories of the week. I'm Adam Byrne, and this is The Square Circle. Hello and welcome to The Square Circle. I'm your host, Adam Byrne. Joining us today are Christian Bernard of Young Voices, Kat Murty of Feminists for Liberty, and political reporter James Rosen. Welcome, everyone.
Great to be here.
The government shutdown has claimed the State of the Union address as its latest victim. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi blocked the address from going forward, prompting this remark from President Trump.
The State of the Union speech has been canceled by Nancy Pelosi because she doesn't want to hear the truth. She doesn't want the American public to hear what's going on. And she's afraid of the truth. And the super left Democrats, the radical Democrats, what's going on in that party is shocking.
And now the president says that he'll wait until the shutdown is over before giving the address. So, James Rosen, we know now from votes in the Senate today that this shutdown is going to continue. So, in the grand scheme of things, how important is the State of the Union aspect of the story?
Well, in the grand scheme of things, it's going to be forgotten. But because the State of the Union it's not statutorily required. It's not in the Constitution. It's a tradition. It's an important tradition when the president comes before both houses of Congress in the House chamber, and you have the Supreme Court justices and members of the cabinet and kind of everybody who's important in the United States government comes. It's the one time where it happens. So it is important symbolically. I think that President Trump, in his style, after having floated these kind of crazy ideas of doing a State of the Union in various other locations, which would have been really become just a total circus because only Republican members would have shown up, and maybe not every Republican. He dropped that idea, and he's now said that when the shutdown is done, that's when he'll give the State of the Union. And he had a statesman-like statement saying that it was within Speaker Pelosi's discretion to decide this, and he's basically bowing to her wishes. I think this shows that Speaker Pelosi's, I think the larger meaning of this, beyond just the issue itself of what the State of the Union, is that once again, Speaker Pelosi period of really several years where she was being criticized and mocked. Some members of her own party ran for speaker against her. They didn't have the support, but that's very telling when a former Speaker of the House is running to have the post again and has opposition. And yet in recent weeks, starting I think with the White House meeting with Senator Schumer and President Trump, and some others over funding for the wall, she very calmly and logically kind of took down a couple of Trump's claims. And so she's kind of emerging as somebody who has figured Trump out and has figured out strategically how to deal with him. And I think that's the significance. I think she emerges from this, again, stronger than she was before.
Kat Murty, Nancy Pelosi's figured Trump out. You just have to say no.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if anyone can figure Trump out, but I really want to take it back to the symbolism of the State of the Union. As James mentioned, while the Constitution does say that the president needs to inform Congress on a regular basis about the State of the Union, they're not at all clear in what format that needs to be. And it's worth mentioning that although our first two presidents did deliver addresses, President Jefferson decided that he would convert it to a letter format because he thought that the president standing up and addressing Congress was too similar to a monarchy. And with the exception of Calvin Coolidge, who did give one address via radio, every other president followed that letter format up until we got to Wilson. Now, if we look at why Wilson decided that he wanted to give it as a speech, the reason that he did that, he was very open about it. He wanted to speak directly to the people and overrule Congress's influence and power. And so I think in that way, this idea of the State of the Union as the sort of rally where the president comes up, on average makes 42 different requests of Congress, and over time has given far fewer facts, far fewer information. I mean, it is very much a pep rally for the executive. And I think one of the advantages, and I cringe a little bit saying this, but one of the advantages of the Trump administration has been that Americans are starting to question how much unconstitutional power we've vested in that executive. And I think it'll be a positive for us if we do actually decide maybe we're going to go back to a letter format. Maybe this is going to be a much more information-based event rather than just being a lot of hoopla around who the president and his party is.
Christian Bernard, how do you see this State of the Union spat?
Right, yeah, I think that Pelosi really did have the White House on its heels when she just straight up said no. I don't think they were expecting her to totally throw all deference to the wayside and just completely say no. But after all, she does have the authority to shut the lights off and not allow him to go in. I was kind of surprised that he didn't try to take advantage of that, like the spectacle of walking into the chamber with the lights off and, I don't know, maybe like live tweet, like doing a live cast,
Live stream from the
live
floor.
cast to the empty audience out there. But then again, he's not somebody who likes to talk to no audience at all. So maybe that's why he capitulated eventually. One thing about your point too earlier about what this means for Pelosi, actually some new favorability polls are out, and she's actually at all-time highs over the last 10 years in her polling, and Trump has sunk back down to I think the lowest he's ever gotten.
It's 35 and 36%.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's worth mentioning that the executive often loses support immediately following the State of the Union. And so at this point, it wouldn't strategically make a lot of sense for him. What I do think could be interesting, Americans over time, the last several State of the Unions, fewer and fewer Americans are watching. I think it'd be kind of interesting to see President Trump take that letter idea that Speaker Pelosi suggested to him and was very much the historical norm, take it to Twitter. Why not do, my dear Americans, this is your State of the Union, a thread?
A long thread.
Yeah, why not?
The State of the Union Twitter thread.
Maybe because apparently the president doesn't know how to thread tweets, and that's one of the ways if
There'll be
he's,
an awful lot of
if
typos.
he's
I'm
writing
sure.
them or not.
Threads,
But I'm wondering if we're getting guilty of focusing too much on this Trump versus Pelosi horse race and less on the substance of what's happening in the shutdown. The votes today mean that there is no end in sight at the moment, and indeed federal workers, 800,000 of them, are going to miss their second paycheck.
I don't think we're focusing too much on the Pelosi-Trump battle, if you will, or standoff. With the Democrats overwhelmingly regaining control of the House last November, they won, I think, 40 seats. There's now a counterweight to President Trump in Washington, and Speaker Pelosi is the head of it. And so this is going to play out many, many times over the next 2 years, and it may go a long way to determining whether President Trump runs, assuming he's still in office with the Mueller investigation, and if he does run, whether he's reelected.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I'd like to remind our viewers now that you can submit your questions to our guests through our website, www.publicsquare.net, or via Facebook or Twitter, and we'll answer as many as we can live on air towards the end of the show. Also this week, a major controversy erupted around a video showing boys from Covington Catholic High School in a seemingly racist confrontation with Native American activist Nathan Phillips. But then a longer video emerged showing a more complicated picture. This caused many commentators to issue apologies to the boys for their rush to judgment. So, Kat Murty, how did you see this argument, and what does this tell us about our social media age?
I think that's a good way to put it, our social media age. This is a story that I think shouldn't really have been a story right from the beginning. I think that it's unclear what happened. It's unclear what people's intentions were. What is clear is that reporters followed what social media was saying and kind of decided that they wanted the scoop on this without actually doing any investigating, without looking into the actual substance of the story. I think that it's certainly quite possible that that different people from different angles, and what was honestly a somewhat controversial and very short moment in the middle of a protest, in the middle of a rally with a bunch of different people there for different reasons. I think that there was probably a lot of people interpreting things very differently from each other, and that message has been sort of hidden. I wish that we could use this more as a teaching moment to talk both about what those interpretations may have been, and also the value of journalists actually doing journalism. I will say, I have to say that one of the things that has frightened me a bit has been the immediate piling on with folks calling for essentially lynch mobs. Originally against the Covington Catholic boys, with all of the folks saying, we should go beat them up, all the people putting essentially like money on their heads or other rewards that may not be appropriate to discuss on TV. We've all seen them. But I think I've also seen some of that people suggesting that the same types of lynch mobby behavior be applied to Nathan Phillips, the Indigenous man who was playing his drum in that scene. And I think as a society we are moving to a very bad place if we're unable to discuss errors and errors interpretation and potential ways in which we're harming each other in an open, polite, discussing way, as opposed to immediately expecting the worst and responding with violence.
And so, Christian Barnard, how did you see it? While the full extent of the clip shows that perhaps the schoolboys were being provoked, they still weren't acting with perhaps the best intentions, were they?
Yeah, I don't think that the events are collapsible to any narrative. So obviously it is, I think the best narrative that you can get from this is that it's a bad idea to run a story. The way Greg Gutfeld referred to this is a story that was too good to be checked. The facts were really not verified at all. But after the kind of rebuttal narrative came out, kind of showing the full 2-hour video of the events leading up to this odd confrontation between the Covington boys and this Indigenous man, I think once that rebuttal came out, people were kind of rushing to post more videos of these Covington kids doing very questionable, if not outright racist things. And I think obviously that is somewhat relevant, but not really at all. I don't think any of the parties in this really need to be investigated any further. Obviously, it cannot be boiled down to one black and white narrative, no pun intended. But yeah, I think that there's definitely blame to go around. Yeah, for sure.
I just want to reiterate, it's not just that journalists jumped on this story or that social media memes jumped on the story and went in one direction. When we got that longer video, folks were also immediately doing this knee-jerk reaction where we were having the same sort of like unsubstantiated claims the other direction. Right. And I think that that's a problem as well.
Okay. And James Rosen, I wanted to ask about the initial Twitter account where this video was published. Seems to be anonymous. It's now been suspended by Twitter. And indeed, people have been looking into it, seem to suggest that potentially someone could have paid for that content to have been spread using that account. How troubling is that?
Well, this is the problem with social media, and as a mainstream journalist, we struggle with this all the time. As my colleagues here have pointed out, there's a lot of bogus stuff on the internet. On the other hand, as mainstream journalists, we're under enormous pressure, partly to do for our financial, with our financial survival, to be quick, to be current, to be covering things that are interesting. And so it's very difficult when you have something that does go viral that involves Native Americans, right to life people, and another group who call themselves the Black Hebrew Israelites, and I won't even touch that, but they were on the hate list, maybe still are, of the Southern Poverty Law Center for having racist, violent views. That's combustible, and it's hard to ignore. You know that thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are following it on the internet. I think there's a different model of journalism that's emerging, which is we'll report what we know, what we can now, and then as new facts emerge, we'll report more. The New York Times did do a very thoughtful a very thorough interview. I don't even know if it was the next day, but it was sometime after the original reports where they said something like the headline was, "A more complex picture emerges of this." And I think my colleagues are right that a lot of this is regrettable. I think, unfortunately, some of it's unavoidable.
I do think it's unavoidable, and I think we're also looking at a learning gap when it comes to the news and the new way that we consume the news and in the digital social world, right? And we've seen that just in terms of who believes fake news. There's a study that came out, I don't remember, sometime in the last couple of weeks that essentially showed boomers were the most likely to believe fake news that they see online versus millennials, but especially Gen Z tend to be a lot more skeptical. And I think it's because they're digital natives. They grew up online. They understand much more, both
Right.
like meme culture, but they also understand that just because it's on the internet doesn't mean that it's true. And I think that that's also just a cultural change that's slowly happening.
Okay.
And very quickly, when you have the President of the United States, POTUS, tweeting to something like 40 million followers, time and again, claims that are demonstrably untrue, untrue, I think all holds are off. I mean, then it just creates a huge opening for anybody else who wants to tweet or put onto social media anything they want. I mean, it really changes the rules, in my opinion.
And one other angle that's emerged from this story is people wondering if that these boys were attending the March for Life rally, pro-life rally, and how many of them were wearing the now famous / infamous Make America Great Again hats and the role that played. I wonder, does anyone find that troubling?
Oh, well, I don't find it troubling necessarily that they were wearing the hats. I don't wear a hat myself. I wouldn't consider myself a Trump supporter. However, I think that you can wear that hat and not be a problematic person, perhaps. That said, I think, again, this comes down to perceptions, and a lot of people do see that hat and they do associate it with a lot of extremely racist, violent views. And so I do think that there's some of that at play.
Yeah, I think that I read a couple of think pieces after this whole thing came out, and there were a couple just talking about just like the visceral response that some people got to just the sight of I think his name is Nick Sandman's face, the kid who was smirking at the indigenous person. Him having this weird kind of bizarre confrontational smile with the Make America Great Again hat on. Just the visual reactions people have to just that view, that reflects the kind of bad, poor assumptions that people immediately have when they see somebody who looks like that. And I do think that's a problem. I agree with what you said, is that like you don't have a right not to be responded to and judged as somebody looks at you. But think about it. These kids are very young. They're in high school. Do they really understand the cultural ramifications for looking that way in public? And do they really deserve even close to be cracked down on and scrutinized in the way that they have been? And not even close.
It's much. I really wish that this was more of a learning moment, because I think that this is an opportunity for folks to understand how other people perceive them and what that means, and to really have a real cultural discussion about the MAGA hats, about what's now been termed the patriarchal smirk, about Nathan Phillips and the proper way to respond to that kind of drumming, that kind of spiritual dance, etc. What would be appropriate, what's not. And I think a lot of this here is just cultural incompetency and a lot of people working from different precepts.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally tonight, political turmoil in Venezuela. The head of the national legislature, Juan Guaidó, declared himself interim president and was recognized as such by President Trump and leaders of several other nations. But incumbent Nicolas Maduro seems to be standing firm against the movement. So, Christian Barnard, should the US be supporting Juan Guaidó, or is this meddling in another country's affairs unnecessarily?
I don't think the recognition on its own is a bad idea. For a long time, the United States has been very unhappy with, and justifiably so, with all the actions of the Maduro regime and the Chavez regime before it. But now it's really hard to know where you go. If you just to recognize an interim president is one thing, but to actually help him get the real power that he'll need to govern is a totally different thing. And while the international community at large might be recognizing Guaido as the legitimate president, Maduro still has the loyalty of a lot of the executive branch, which has overrun the National Assembly, which is the legislative branch that Guaido is the head of. So where you go from here is a very, very difficult question. I think the United States needs to tread very carefully, because anytime they exhibit any kind of hawkish language, Maduro actually uses that to stir up his base and say, look, these DC swamp dwellers, he doesn't say that, but want to come in and take over. And it actually plays to his favor. So Trump earlier, I think yesterday, said that he wasn't ruling out military intervention. I think that is very unwise to say. It actually is playing right into Maduro's hand.
Yeah, and indeed the Venezuelan military do say that they are still behind President Maduro, or if we call him President Maduro now, I'm not sure. So how do you view the Trump administration's actions here?
Well, I think, there's been a lot of talk in recent months, more and more, about how the United States were kind of sliding back into the Cold War because of Russia meddling in our elections and other things that are going on. This episode is, I think, really reminiscent of the Cold War, because throughout the Cold War, for decades, you had Russia and the United States throughout Latin America, supporting different governments, different factions, and actually overthrowing both sides, or paying local folks to overthrow democratically elected governments. I think one thing that's actually better about this episode is that it's playing out we talked about the internet. It's playing out in public. The previous histories that I'm talking about in the Cold War, it was done completely in secret. The CIA had these secret slush funds. The KGB had their secret slush funds. And we often, the Americans, didn't find out about. Pinochet was an example in Chile. The Shah of Iran was an example there. The Americans often didn't find out about these secret covert operations for years. And now, at least, it's happening in real time. So I think that's an advantage. But I think the bigger point is that you've got Russia on one side here, you got the United States on the other side with most of Western Europe. Turkey, even though it's a NATO member, is an unsettling exception. This is feeling more and more like the Cold War, only it's going to be played out on the internet.
Yeah, indeed. Nicolas Maduro today saying that Russian President Vladimir Putin had told him that he could count on Russia. So how concerned should we be about that?
Well, honestly, I think that James made a really good point. I think it's a positive that we've seen this be a much more open, transparent change. It's one that I'm somewhat cautiously hopeful for. It's worth mentioning the state that Venezuela was in was very poor, very poor. There's rampant starvation. There's shortages of medical supplies. There's rampant inflation. Things were not going well. 80% of the Venezuelan people no longer back Maduro and believe that he violated the Constitution and fixed the election in order to win. So I do think that the Venezuelan people do not want Maduro as their leader, and I think that I hope that Guaido will be a better future forward for them. I think that it was correct for the United States and for all of the other countries we've seen in Europe and Latin America to recognize this regime change in as much as it is. But I would caution against us getting militarily or otherwise involved, because I think it's going to create a much worse situation.
Okay, thank you very much. And now it's time to take some questions from our viewers. And we start with Christopher Larson, who asks, where were the chaperones for the Covington boys, and what is their role in this situation?
I think that obviously you can ask the question of where the adults were with these boys. It's actually interesting to see how the community has responded to the backlash and then the additional reporting. I think that the community has actually very much defended the Covington boys' behavior, maybe to a fault. I think that plenty of the footage that we see, it might not be outright condemning, but it is definitely, I think, embarrassing. And I think it's a good time for parents to really reflect carefully about, hey, how can we use this as a learning experience? We probably shouldn't just defend our boys and leave that at that. But I think it's a valid question. Obviously, there were other adults on the camera as well. Nathan Phillips is very much an adult. The Black Hebrew Israelites are also adults. So I think it's also valid to question, why were the adults in the video behaving the way they were?
Towards what are essentially children.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm glad that Christian brought up the community's response. But I also want to focus on the school's response, right? Because these are high school students. They were brought up by their school to represent the school in a political march, the March for Life. Their parents assumedly believed that the school was going to be protecting them from whatever happened. And then all of a sudden, as soon as a situation happens, the school, which had wanted these boys to represent them, to promote their political views, when that went the wrong way, immediately was turning to potentially expelling or suspending the boys. We didn't hear any sort of any responsibility being taken by the school, and up until we saw more of a community pushback. And I think that shows a lot of lacking. The schools should be nurturing these boys both to respond better in those kinds of situations, and also, again, to make this a teaching moment, a learning moment, not a moment to circle their wagons around their own administration.
Okay.
I just want
Yeah,
I want to answer the question directly, which is, I don't know where the chaperones were, but they should have been there. My child went through the Fairfax County school system, one of the largest in the country, and that situation would not have been allowed to develop. The chaperones would have stepped in, and it would have been cut off.
Absolutely. Well, our next question comes then from Rachel Jenkins, who asks, and we're going back to the premise of the shutdown, how it all started, do you think the Trump border wall will ever get built?
Look, honestly, we already have a lot of wall. Largely the places where we don't have a wall are private property. What we're looking at, if we want to build that wall, is massive eminent domain. People's property is going to be taken away from them. They may or may not be compensated in the long run. Historically, it's been decades before folks are compensated. And at what ends? The majority of people who are in this country and undocumented did not cross the border illegally.
Okay, and very quickly, the wall, is it ever going to happen?
As Trump envisions it, no.
I hope not.
Okay. Well, now it's time for our most underreported story of the week. And who would like to start?
I'll start because I just have a really heartwarming underreported story. There is a man in Pennsylvania who not only has a pet alligator, but his pet alligator is a rescue alligator by the name of Wally. And not only does he have a rescue alligator, but his Wally is an officially registered emotional support animal, and Wally loves to eat. What's Wally's favorite food? He loves to eat French fries and things like that.
Chicken wings.
Chicken wings. Chicken wings is his favorite. He lives, when he's not in the lap of this gentleman, on his back with his belly being scratched. He and a tiny rescue alligator named Scrappy live in a plastic swimming pool. So it's a very heartwarming story.
It is a heartwarming story for 2019. We'll see what happens when he tries to take it on Delta Airlines. Kat, what was your underreported story?
Yeah, definitely. I think we've been hearing a lot about how this administration has unfortunately targeted Americans who are not clearly on one side or the other of the gender-sex binary. However, one thing that I think I haven't heard enough about, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives recently passed down guidance that the form that is required for everyone to fill in to be able to purchase a gun requires you to select either male or female as a sex, even though gender non-binary IDs are legally acceptable. This is not a question of security. This is not a question of figuring out who someone is. This is simply a question of denying trans and non-binary Americans their Second Amendment right to a gun.
Okay, Christian, take us home with your underreported
This
story.
week was National School Choice Week. It's when parents, policymakers, and nonprofits around the country celebrate taking educational decisions for their kids' educations back into their hands.
Okay.
That's
Well, there it is. And that is all for this week. I'm Adam Byrne. Thank you for watching The Square Circle. We'll see you next week.